good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to follow one of the most remarkable and complex lives in all of history, the story of Genghis Khan. How did a boy, born on the harsh steppes of Mongolia, rise to unite the tribes, conquer empires, and build one of the largest realms the world has ever known? Who was he before the name Genghis Khan echoed across continents? And what kind of world did he leave behind? We'll trace his journey from childhood struggles and exile to the rise of his army, the expansion of his empire, and the lasting influence his rule left on trade, culture, and the shape of the modern world. It is a story of ambition, endurance, and transformation, of how one person's vision changed the course of history. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to unwind, to learn something new, or to drift off while traveling through the past, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. The wind is the first teacher on the Mongolian grassland. It hardens the skin, scours the eyes clear, and carries 1,000 scents that mean life or danger. In that wind, on the banks of the Onon River in the 12th century, a child named Temujin entered a world that measured worth in horses, kin, and courage. Later chronicles would remember an omen at his birth, that he clenched a clot of blood in his fist, a sign on the steppe that the child would grow into a fighter. Whether or not the omen was real, the life that followed gave the legend a tight fit. Temujin belonged to the Borzhigin, a lineage that claimed the blue wolf and fallow doe as ancient ancestors. His father, Yasuge, led a small following that hunted, raided, and bartered across the valleys east of the Khingan. His mother, Ho Lun, was not Borzhigin by birth. She had been taken as a young woman from the Olkunid people, while betrothed to a Merkit man named Chiledu. Yasuge led the abduction during a ride along the Onon. The act was common in steppe politics, cruel to modern eyes, yet woven into the fabric of alliance and vengeance. Ho Lun adapted to her new life with a will that would later keep her children alive when the tribe turned its back. The boy was named in a manner that linked private memory and public rivalry. Yasuge had recently captured a Tatar called Temujin Uge, and so the newborn took the captive's name. The Tatars were old enemies of the Borzhigin, loyal to the great Jin state beyond the frontier. To carry the name of a defeated foe was a reminder of the unsettled balance between the tribes, a small victory recorded in a family cradle. The steppe shaped the first education of Temujin. He learned to sit a shaggy pony before he could speak in full phrases. He learned to track gazelle, to judge the weight of a river by its sound, and to read the lines of a distant ridge for the movement of men. A child in a felt tent learned early that hunger waited at the edge of the firelight. In spring, the herds foaled and lambed. In summer, the families drove their carts to richer grass. In autumn, the men hunted and raided. In winter, they went quiet and watched the horizon for enemies. There was no palace tutor, no book laid open on a table, but there was a school of keen observation, of weather and horseflesh and human temper. Temujin's earliest political lesson came with his first betrothal. When he was perhaps 9, Yasuge arranged a marriage with the Ongirat, a tribe that controlled good pasture along the Kerulen. The girl was called Borte. She came from a family whose elders understood that marriages joined more than 2 people. Yasuge took his son to the Ongirat camp to live for a time among his future in-laws, according to custom. On the journey home, Yasuge stopped to share a meal with Tatars, who recognized him and poisoned him. He reached his own camp alive, but the poison finished its work. The death of a chieftain often meant the splintering of his people. In this case, it meant the abandonment of a widow and her children to the lean edges of the steppe. The Taichud, who had been allies of Yasuge, refused to follow a boy. They stripped the camp of what they could carry and moved away, leaving Holan with her sons and daughters to fend for themselves. The secret history of the Mongols preserves the bitterness of that time. Holan dug edible roots from the riverbank and taught her children to snare mice and marmots. They fished through a hole in the ice. They learned to sleep lightly and to hide their horses in the dark. The difference between hunger and survival could be the weight of a rabbit caught at dusk. This hard schooling carved deep marks into Temujin's character. It taught him that kin could fail and that loyalty was not a birthright. It taught him that a small household, if united, could live through what should have broken them. It taught him that mercy could be as scarce as meat in February, and that one must make one's own network of trust. That network began with the first men who chose Temujin rather than bloodline as their cause. The tale is told of a poor herdsman named Sorkan Shira. The Taichud captured the teenage Temujin, placed a heavy kangu around his neck, and kept him like a showpiece in their camp. One night during a feast, Temujin slipped his bonds and ran to the river. Sorkan Shira found the boy in the reeds and might have earned reward by turning him in. Instead, he hid him in his own jir and risked his life to help the fugitive. When Temujin later stood in command of thousands, he remembered the herdsman and raised his family. The memory of that kindness became a private rule. Reward those who help you when you are poor, and do not forget the lowly. Another early companion was Borchu. Temujin had lost a horse to raiders and met the youth while seeking it. Borchu rode out with him through the night, and they caught the thieves and recovered the animals. Temujin asked what reward he wanted. Borchu asked for nothing and stayed. In later years, he would lead men across the length of North China and keep the confidence of his lord when older nobles faltered. Jelme came too, a man of the Uriankai who nursed Temujin through a wound. There were others, names that appear for a page or two and then drop away. But the pattern is clear. Temujin built his first following through personal obligation and visible fairness rather than inherited rank. The household was not without its own storms. One of the darkest came within the family itself. Temujin and his half-brother Beta quarreled during a lean season. The quarrel was over meat and authority, the two currencies that matter most when food is scarce. Temujin and his full brother Kasar shot Beta with arrows and left him dead on the ground. Holan cursed the act and told them they had made enemies of their own shadows. It is a moment that sits at the center of the boy's moral education. He learned what it meant to cross a line that no elder would bless. Later, when he held the lives of rivals in his hands, he sometimes remembered and chose restraint. Not always, and not gently, but more often than his enemies expected. There is another thread in the weave of his youth, the friendship with Jamuka. They met as boys, shared play and milk, and swore the old oath of Anda, a bond that made friends into brothers. They pledged to aid one another and to part the meat and drink in equal shares. The words would echo through their lives. In youth, the oath meant sharing a blanket and dreams of the future. In manhood, it would become a test of ambition and a record of betrayal and forgiveness. While Temujin gathered companions, he also learned to read the politics of the steppe beyond his family. He watched the Karaite and their ruler Togrul, whom the Chinese sources called Ong Khan. He watched the Nayman tribes to the west and the Tatars to the southeast. He heard of raids sponsored by the jinn to keep the tribes divided. He began to understand that survival would require a patron who could shelter him while he forged a larger coalition. The chance came through a gift that seems small on its own and immense in what it purchased. When Temujin reached manhood, he set out to claim Borte from her family, as promised long ago. The Onggirat elders honored the agreement. They sent the young couple away with a dowry, among which was a sable coat of rare quality. Temujin did not keep the coat. He rode south with it until he found the camp of Togrul. He presented the coat to the Karaite ruler and asked to be treated as a son in memory of the old friendship between Togrul and Yesugei. Togrul accepted. He called Temujin his son and promised help. It was the first great political gain of Temujin's life, achieved not through a raid but through the studied use of kin memory, courtesy, and gift. The alliance with Togrul gave Temujin more than a shield. It gave him a model of rule and an audience of powerful men. The Karaite were Christians of the Nestorian rite, at least at court, and had long traded with the north of China. Their camp was a place where messengers from the Jin and the Khitan Liao had once brought gifts and demands. Temujin watched how a Khan received envoys and divided spoils, how he rewarded loyalty and how he punished betrayal. He watched and took notes in his head. His own rule later would not copy the Karaite pattern, but he had seen how a larger polity could be managed, and how a chieftain could be more than a robber captain. The sacred history, which records the words of Mongol elders and poets, carries a prayer that Temujin offered during a moment of fear on the slopes of Burkhan Khaldun. He had climbed the mountain to escape enemies, and there vowed to honor it if he lived. He would later declare the mountain sacred to his family and insist that all who crossed it show respect. The moment matters because it shows a side of the young man that is often lost beneath the armor of the conqueror. He was not a sneering skeptic. He believed that eternal heaven watched and judged, that oaths mattered, and that a man who broke them would find his luck burn away. His later insistence on the safety of envoys and the keeping of bargains grows from the same soil. In these years, Temujin also practiced the grammar of steppe combat. He learned how to break a pursuit and turn it into a trap, how to feign flight and draw an enemy into open ground, how to signal with flags and torches across a wide front. He had no siege engines, no regiments of infantry, and no written orders. Yet he had a nimble brain and a gift for seeing how a skirmish might become a decision. The bow was the heart of his art. A Mongol bow was a layered thing of horn, wood, and sinew, short enough to use from the saddle, yet strong enough to punch through armor at distance. A rider could loose a shaft while hanging off the side of his pony to make himself a thinner target. A boy learned to do this for sport, and later he did it for his life. The world beyond the grassland remained a rumor and an opportunity. Chinese traders came to the borders with bolts of silk and iron pots, and with them came stories of walls that ran along the spine of mountains and of cities shaped like squares. Merchants from the Islamic lands brought glass and cloth, and told of markets where a man might spend a year and never visit the same stall twice. For the moment, these were tales that warmed a cold night. Temujin's concerns were nearer and sharper. Keep the horses healthy. Keep the family fed. Keep the friends you have and win a few more. The first chapter of his life does not end with a coronation. It ends with a tent and a promise. Temujin sat with Borte under felt and hide, the precious sable coat now gone from his hands and resting on Togrul's shoulders. Outside, the horses cropped the frostburn from the grass. In a nearby camp, Burcu and Jelme shared meat and spoke of the ride to come. Somewhere in the dark, Jamuka thought of his Anda and of the day when they would ride together again. The boy who had learned to dig roots from frozen ground had begun to learn a different art, the one in which a man arranges people as carefully as he once arranged snares for rabbits. The wind pressed against the gur and hissed its approval through the seams. The break of day on the steppe can be kind or cruel. On a morning that lived in memory for a lifetime, it was cruel. Temujin's camp lay quiet along a fold of ground near the Onon. Smoke from the night fires thinned into the cold air. Horses cropped at the rim of light. The men who stood watch felt more ease than they should have. The Merkit riders came out of the pale dawn like a flock of crows that had chosen a single kill. They had old business with Holun's family, and with the man who had taken her from them. They came for vengeance, and for women. They found what they sought. The attack was sudden and well chosen. The smaller camp could not hold. Temujin fought to cover his family, then broke away with a few companions and drove his horses for the slopes of Burkan Khaldun. Bort could not escape. She was taken with other women and children and carried north toward the Merkit pastures. The old story of abduction had come again to the Borjigin, this time as a wound rather than a bargain. In the rough shelter of birch and stone on the sacred mountain, Temujin spoke to the sky and to the land. He swore to honor the mountain if it saved him. He sent word to two men whose names mattered more than any other. One was Togrul, the Karaite ruler who had accepted him as a foster son when Temujin placed the sable coat in his hands. The other was Jamuka, the sworn brother of his youth. Both answered. The calls of blood and oath carried weight on the steppe when the debt was plain. What followed was the first large command that Temujin had a hand in shaping. The Karaite arrived in strength. Jamuka brought a tide of riders from his own following. Temujin, still a minor leader, added what he could. Together they tracked the raiders across rivers and through willow-choked valleys. The Merkit had taken their prize to a camp where they felt secure among kin. Security is a dangerous sentiment on the steppe. The allied host came upon the camp at speed. Arrows rose and fell like blown thistles. The Merkit broke and scattered along the watercourses. Borte was found alive and brought to Temujin's arms. Holun's younger sister was also rescued. In that moment, the alliances that would shape the next decade were forged in gratitude and in a common victory. The camp that formed in the wake of that triumph was a living school. The Karaite had traveled with their court clerks, their men-at-arms, their priests of the Nestorian rite, and messengers who knew the tracks that led to the Jin frontier and beyond. Jamuka's riders brought a princely swagger born of long pedigree. Temujin brought a smaller circle of men who believed in him for reasons that had nothing to do with ancestry. For a time, the three camps braided together. They hunted the same game, feasted from the same kettles, and told stories that polished old reputations and carved new ones. It was during these months that the birth of Jochi set a quiet fuse. Borte had been among the Merkit long enough for doubt to voice itself through the gossip that is never entirely silent in a nomad camp. Temujin accepted Jochi as his son and treated him as such in every public act. Even so, the whisper followed the boy. In years to come, brothers would use that whisper as a blade. For now, the child's birth symbolized the survival of the household after a blow that might have ended it. There were more practical lessons at hand. Temujin watched how Togrul received delegations and how quickly he reached decisions. He studied the patrols that rode outward from the Kerite camp and the signals they used to call attention to a stranger sighted along a ridge. He watched how Jamuka kept his noble followers loyal through gifts and how he lost their respect with careless words. He saw how little time it took for pride to turn into resentment when one man felt another gain in fame at his expense. The long stay together ended, as such gatherings always do, with a decision to part before envy broke the bond. Temujin chose to strike his own camp and leave the circle of his foster father and his Anda. He was encouraged in that decision by the women who stood closest to him. Holun had an unerring sense for the moment when gratitude becomes a leash. Borte, who would prove a calm strategist in private, agreed. Temujin spoke with Jamuka, and they used the words of brotherhood. But beneath those words lay the friction that further closeness would not ease. When Temujin moved away, 41 households of significant men followed him. They did not do this for gold trinkets or from fear. They did it because they had watched how Temujin divided meat and how he kept a promise, and they preferred that kind of fairness to the old games of rank. The split made the tension open. A year or two of careful moves followed. Camps shifted as each leader weighed pasture, water, and the drift of alliances across the steppe. Rival tribes watched and made their own calculations. The Tatar, favored at times by the Jin as a counterweight to the Borjigin, kept a wary distance. The Taichiud, who had once abandoned Holun, had not forgotten the young man they had hunted. The Merkits smoldered and looked for allies. All the while, Temujin worked on the ground under his feet. He organized his companions into squads that could act without waiting for him to be present. He created small groups of 10 and of 100 that mixed men from different families. He did this in embryo, long before he had the power to make every tribe accept such a change. The habit of breaking old lines and drawing new ones based on service began here and not later. War announced itself at a place remembered as Dalan Baljut. Jamuka had the larger following and the older names. He had also gathered a coalition of clans who feared what Temujin represented. They did not want a world where a herdsman's son might outrank a prince. They wanted the old order to continue, with its clear pecking of privilege at every feast. When the two hosts met, the sky was thick with kestrels, and the ground shook with the drumming of hooves. Temujin's men fought hard, but were outnumbered. He took a wound and barely escaped with his life. Jamuka did not content himself with victory. He ordered the boiling of captive leaders and the mutilation of others. That cruelty made a mark more lasting than the battle itself. Men who had served Jamuka felt shame and fear. Some drifted away in the months that followed and found Temujin's camp, where they were received, forgiven, and employed. Temujin did not fall into despair after Dalan Baljut. He did what he always did. He moved, listened, and rebuilt. There is an account that suggests he spent time in the lands of the Jin, perhaps as a mercenary, perhaps as a prisoner who found a way to make his captors see his utility. Chinese envoys later wrote of a Mongol leader who learned something of their ways before returning to the steppe with a sharper sense of the world beyond it. Whether this refers to Temujin or to one of his close circle, the effect is visible in any case. When he reappeared with purpose, he carried with him a deeper understanding of the power that lay across the frontier, and of how frontier politics could be turned to his advantage. By the middle of the 1190s, the map of the steppe had changed again. Temujin resolved old scores with a mix of ruthless blows and careful pardons. He turned against the Tatars, long the source of family grief. In a campaign that cut through their pasture like a knife through felt, he broke their power. He killed or dispersed their chiefs and folded the rank and file into his own following. One man among the captives confessed that he had shot Temujin's horse from under him in battle. Temujin admired the man's honesty and courage and spared him. He gave him a new name, Jebe, the Arrow. The man became one of his most skilled commanders, a cavalry leader whose eye for terrain and instinct for surprise would terrify enemies from Manchuria to the Dnieper. At the same time, Temujin used his connection to Togrul to settle matters among the Karaite. A faction had risen against the old ruler. Temujin rode in support, put down the rebellion, and left the Karaite throne more secure. That act pleased the older man, as a father is pleased by a son who has acted with sense. It also raised murmurs among those who watched with jealousy. Temujin's prestige grew with each success. Prestige on the steppe is as dangerous as it is useful. It gathers men and notice in equal measure. The connection to the Jin court continued to play its part. In 1196, the Jin turned against some rebel Tatar groups and called on steppe allies to join the punitive expedition. Temujin answered. He fought well, sent prisoners and heads as proof of service, and received a title and gifts in return. That brief alignment with a sedentary empire bewildered some of his enemies and pleased others who saw in it the mark of a leader who could move across boundaries without embarrassment. Temujin took what he needed from the alliance and gave back only what did not cost him dearly. Around this time his household grew more complex. His sons by birth were now old enough to begin to ride with small companions and to learn the work of command in the smallest measure. Jochi, despite the shadow of rumor, showed courage and generosity. Chagatai showed a hard sense of law and an iron mouth. Ogade had the gift of friendship, a man who could calm a quarrel before it hardened. Tolui, the youngest, had a fire in him that men noticed when he was still a boy. Temujin watched his sons as carefully as he watched his officers. He arranged marriages that would bind tribes to his tent. He listened to Borte, who advised him in private, and to Holan, who never lost her taste for blunt truth. The old friendship with Jamuka did not go quiet. From time to time, messages passed and efforts were made to find a way back to the simplicity of youth. The steppe does not often allow such wishes to complete themselves. Jamuka could not accept a world in which men of no lineage stood beside princes. Temujin would not return to the old hierarchy. Their paths diverged even when their words tried to meet. Defections continued to wear down the old guard. Men who had been present at the boiling of captives after Dalan Baljut found themselves unable to shake the memory. They chose a camp where justice felt cleaner even when it was hard. Some came after a private quarrel with a chief who had slighted them. Some came because a shaman had spoken of a destiny written in the sky. Some came because they wanted their sons to rise higher than they themselves had risen. Temujin welcomed them with a measured hand. He distributed them across his growing units and made sure that no man served only with his cousins and brothers. That decision, small at first, would become the skeleton of a new order. The years around the turn of the century were a crucible. Temujin had failed, retreated, learned, and returned to the field stronger and more sure. He had bound himself to a powerful patron and begun to know that a patron can be both a shelter and a future problem. He had saved his wife and his honor with borrowed strength and repaid that debt with service and victory. He had turned enemies into commanders and whispers into discipline. He had begun to speak less of personal slights and more of a work that surpassed the old games of raiding and revenge. The steppe was not yet ready to accept that work, but men had begun to hear the idea. In a camp on a late autumn night, Temujin sat in council with Burchu, Jelme, Jebe, and a handful of elders. The firelight made islands of faces and left the rest in shadow. They considered where to move when the first snows came, which tribe had grown more brittle and might be ready to split, which ally would remain true if asked to choose between old pride and new promise. Outside, a young rider in a threadbare coat held 2 horses and waited for the order to carry messages. He did not know that he would ride for a nation that did not yet exist. He knew only that the cold bit a little less when a man stood near a horse. The years that followed Temujin's recovery of Borte were a slow, grinding ascent. The steppe is a land of long distances, and power on the steppe grows in much the same way. A leader collects households and loyalties one by one. He proves that he can keep men fed in winter and rich in summer. He shows that his word holds when fortune turns sour. In such a world, reputation travels farther than a rider can in a day. And by the turn of the century, Temujin's name was in many mouths. Jamukha's victory at Dalan Baljut had not ended the contest. It had sharpened it. Men remembered the boiling of captives and the mutilations that followed. Such acts declare a particular kind of rule, and many warriors who had respected Jamukha's lineage began to look at Temujin's camp with new interest. They found there a different atmosphere. A man might be of humble birth and still sit close to the fire if he had served well. Loot was divided by contribution. Quarrels were settled quickly and without favoritism. It was not a soft camp. It was a camp where rules were clear, and that clarity drew those who were tired of being slighted by older clans. Temujin rebuilt with patience. He raided where it served a purpose, and parleyed where talk could buy time. He kept close ties with Togrul, and earned his favor by suppressing a Karaite revolt. He made the Karaite cause his own in that moment, and the older ruler was pleased, calling Temujin's son and giving him grazing rights that mattered when the herds were thin. There was affection in the bond, and there was calculation on both sides. Temujin needed a shelter while he gathered strength. Togrul needed a vigorous lieutenant who could bring hard-riding men to a fight at short notice. Old enemies were handled with ruthless simplicity. The Tatars, who had poisoned Yasuge, felt the weight of Temujin's anger. He struck them in a series of swift blows that shattered their leadership. He ordered that adult male Tatars who had resisted be put to death as an act of vengeance and as a cold lesson to others. Their common warriors and their families were taken in and scattered among Temujin's own followers. Among the defeated was a bowman who confessed that he had once brought down Temujin's mount with a shaft in battle. Temujin admired the courage of the confession and the skill that had created the opportunity. He spared the man and renamed him Jebe, the arrow. That decision would matter greatly in years to come, for Jebe proved to be a commander of rare vision and daring. By the year that many later counted as 1201, the steppe had divided into 2 great tendencies. One ran with Jamukha and with the older families, who wanted a world in which noble blood guaranteed noble place. The other gathered, sometimes quietly, and sometimes with noisy celebration, around Temujin and the idea that talent and loyalty could outrank pedigree. The lines did not fall cleanly. Brothers were sometimes on opposite sides. A man could admire Jamuka's glamour and still dislike the cruel spectacle that had followed Dalan Baljut. A man could mistrust Temujin's disregard for ancient privilege and still seek his tent because he was tired of being ignored by princely cousins. The steppe world is never a simple field of chessmen. It is a web of marriages, grudges, and calculations about grass and water. Rival coalitions formed. Jamuka's supporters proclaimed him Gur Khan, a title that echoed far in the memory of steppe peoples. They mustered Taichud, Naiman allies, and families that had felt their pride pricked by Temujin's rise. Temujin and Togrul stood together, and many lesser groups watched to see which wind would prove the stronger. A battle at a place remembered as Yedi Kunan tested the lines. Temujin and Togrul used mobility and patience to wear down the opposition and sent them home with a lesson that the new alliance could stand its ground against old names. The next year, Temujin finished what he had begun with the Tatars and folded their commoners into his ranks. He had learned that one way to break the old order was to mix men from different clans into new units that owed loyalty upward rather than sideways. He began to form bodies of 10 and of 100 that cut across lineage. He did not yet have the power to impose this pattern everywhere, but he practiced it wherever his authority reached. The habit of mixing men made it harder for local chiefs to carry a troop away at a moment's annoyance, and made it easier for Temujin to move his forces as a single hand rather than a clutch of fingers that might open at the wrong time. Tension with the Karaite alliance gathered around a marriage proposal. Temujin suggested that his eldest son Jochi should marry a daughter of Togrul. It was a normal way to seal a partnership on the steppe, yet in this case the suggestion touched raw nerves. Whispers about Jochi's birth had not died, and some Karaite nobles treated the proposal as an insult. Sengum, the son of Togrul, disliked Temujin's growing reputation and feared that the younger man's camp would overshadow his own when the time came for inheritance. Jamuka spoke into this unease, warning that Temujin's habit of raising common men would erode the dignity of noble lines. An ambush was planned to remove Temujin. Two herdsmen who had the habit of listening hard while they minded their animals heard of the trap and carried the news to Temujin's tent. He slipped away with his core following before the jaws could close. What followed were weeks of peril. At Kalakaljid Sands, Temujin suffered a severe defeat. His camp was scattered. His family was in danger of falling into enemy hands. It looked as though the story might end in a familiar way, with the victor displaying trophies of the vanquished at the next feast. The escape that saved Temujin and the oath that followed have lived in Mongol memory ever since. He gathered a small band at a water that some remembered as Baljuna. Their horses were spent. Their stores were gone. Temujin slaughtered his own mount to feed those who stayed. They mixed the muddy water with mare's milk and shared it. They swore that if heaven allowed them to rise again, they would share wealth and hardship, and that they would never forget those who had stood in the mud beside that water. Those men were not all of one tribe, or even of one faith. They were bound by personal loyalty and by a promise that a new order would reward service first. Later, chroniclers would minimize this episode because the group included non-Mongols, but among the men who lived it, the oath was a foundation stone. The Baljuna companions formed a cadre that Temujin would trust with his life in battles yet to come. Recovery came through a combination of ruse and persistence. Temujin split his forces and used a feigned retreat to draw Karaite detachments into ground of his choosing. He struck their flank with men who had waited in cover and then pressed the fight until the Karaite line broke. Togrul fled and died at the hands of strangers who did not recognize him. Sengum rode for distant refuge. Temujin absorbed the Karaite people as he had absorbed the Tatars. He married into the defeated royal family and arranged marriages for his sons that turned old pretenders into members of his household. Sorgatani, a young woman of Karaite lineage who would one day shape the destinies of grandsons, entered the family at this time. With the Karaite cause shattered, only the Naiman Confederation stood as a serious block to Temujin's dominance. The Naiman had long looked westward as well as eastward. They had contacts with the settled realms beyond the Altai and with the remnants of the Khitan world. Their chief, remembered as Tayang Khan, was brave but indecisive. With him was Kuchlug, a younger man who had more nerve than judgment. Jamukha had found shelter among them and urged them to strike Temujin before his momentum became irresistible. The fight came in the high country, in a place some called Chakemot. Temujin's army had adapted to larger-scale operations. Scouts rode far ahead and to the sides. Flag signals and the smoke of dung fires carried orders across long fronts. The core of his force remained mounted archers who could deliver a storm of shafts and then close with lances and sabers when the enemy line wavered. The Naiman fought hard and tried to draw Temujin into rough ground where his ponies would lose their edge. Jebe and Kasar felt for soft places in the enemy line and found them. The battle lasted for days rather than hours. When the Naiman broke, they broke completely. Tayang Khan fell, and Kuchlug fled with a band of followers toward the west. Jamukha slipped away into the hills. The Naiman people went the way of the Karaite and the Tatars, folded into the growing body of those who called Temujin Khan. The ending of the rivalry with Jamukha is one of the strangest and most telling scenes in the whole saga. Jamukha's own men betrayed him and brought him bound to Temujin, hoping to buy favor. Temujin ordered the traitors executed for breaking their bond. Loyalty mattered more to him than temporary advantage. He offered Jamukha forgiveness and a return to brotherhood if he would accept a subordinate role in the new order. Jamukha refused. He asked for a death that would not spill his blood, the last privilege of a prince. Temujin granted the request. They spoke as men who remembered sharing a blanket as boys, and then the old friend was gone. The death closed a chapter that had begun with milk in a shared bowl. The steppe now lay open to a work that no one had managed for generations. Temujin summoned a great assembly beside the waters of the upper Onum. The chiefs and elders came, as did the captains of the new units, who owed rank to their service rather than to old lineages. The assembly proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan. Scholars have argued about the meaning of the title. Some say it evokes the idea of the ocean and therefore of vastness. Some hear in it a sense of firmness, a ruler who cannot be moved. Whatever the root, the effect was clear. A man who had survived poverty, capture, betrayal, and defeat had been raised as ruler of a united people. This unification was not a mere etiquette of titles. It was a change in the way power flowed. Temujin set out to weaken the old ties of clan and to strengthen ties to the center. He confirmed the practice of organizing men by tens, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands. He took warriors from defeated tribes and placed them in units commanded by his followers, so that a man could no longer ride only beside cousins and brothers. He enlarged his personal guard, the keshig, to a body of chosen men who lived close to his person and learned the work of command and administration. He chose promising youths from families all across his realm to serve in that guard, which ensured both loyalty and a pool of trained officers for future campaigns. He ordered that lists be kept, that shares of booty be recorded with care, and that no soldier take more than his due. He established punishments for theft, for desertion, and for harming envoys. He gave privileges to priests, monks, imams, and physicians who served the common good. He encouraged the use of the Uyghur script and gathered scribes who could turn a spoken decision into a written command that would outlast memory. He began to think of posts where fresh horses could be kept so that messages could race faster than any single mount could carry them. All of this took shape quickly once the chiefs had recognized his rule, but the roots of it lay in the years when he mixed men from different lineages and watched Uyghur clerks at Toghrul's elbow. The transformation also had a human face. Temujin rewarded those who had stood with him at Baljuna with gifts and commands. Burchu and Jelmi received the honor due to men who had saved lives and kept faith through disaster. Jebe was given scope to plan and execute far-ranging strikes. Mukali, a stalwart who would later bring whole provinces under control, rose as a pillar of the new order. The wives and mothers who had kept the tents warm through hunger also moved into view. Borte remained the calm center of the household. Holan, the mother who had scolded her sons for killing a brother and who had kept them alive on roots and fish, watched as the boy she had fed became a man whom whole peoples now obeyed. When the chiefs lifted Temujin upon a felt carpet and hailed him as Genghis Khan, the sound rolled across the Onon like a drumbeat. The title was not the end of a struggle, but the beginning of a different kind of work. A people had been gathered. Now that people needed rules they would respect, officers they would obey, roads that would carry orders without confusion, and a purpose that reached beyond private vengeance. The steppe had seen conquerors before. What made this moment unusual was that a conqueror set out to build a state. The foundations were practical. Genghis reinforced the decimal structure that he had used in embryo during his rise. Men were organized in units of 10, of 100, of 1,000, and of 10,000. These were not mere numbers. They were instruments for breaking the old power of lineage. Riders were mixed so that cousins no longer rode only beside cousins. Commanders were chosen for their proven steadiness and courage, rather than for the length of their grandfather's titles. In this way, a man who had once mended harness for a living might find himself responsible for 100 riders if he showed judgment and resolve. The steppe took notice. Nobles who disdained the sight found it hard to argue with the results when these units moved like a single creature under fire. Near the person of the Khan stood the keshig, the day and night guard. It began as a small body and grew into a school of government. Young men of promise from families across the realm were brought into the guard. They served close to the ruler, learned the manner of councils, learned the discipline of record-keeping, and carried messages that could not be entrusted to anyone else. The guard bound the great families to the center by honor and by the quiet knowledge that their sons were near the fire where decisions were taken. Law followed organization. We call it the yasa because later chroniclers used that word. There was no single parchment hung in a temple. The law lived in proclamations, in precedents, and in the memory of scribes who set down what the Khan ruled. Its themes were clear: Theft of livestock was punished without hesitation. Murder within the tent circle met swift justice. Soldiers were forbidden to abandon comrades in battle. Shares of booty were to be recorded and divided according to sound rules so that jealousy and rumor did not rot discipline. Adultery, the abduction of women, and the sale of persons were curbed with penalties that aimed to keep the fragile ligament of the camp intact. Above all stood the rule that envoys were sacred. A messenger could cross frontiers under protection. To harm him was to challenge not only the Khan but the order he was building. Religion did not become a knife. Priests of many kinds moved through the camps without fear. Nestorian monks walked beside Buddhist lamas. Muslims found space to pray and to judge disputes of their own, with imams as referees. Shamans still lifted their drums and called upon the spirits of land and sky. Genghis encouraged them to keep to their own rights and forbade the persecution of any who kept the peace. In a world that would soon stretch from the forests to the deserts, tolerance was not a fashion. It was a statecraft as vital as food for the horses. The Khan gave his words wings. Couriers needed more than courage. They needed fresh mounts at known stations and a token that opened the hand of any household along the way. Genghis established a chain of relay posts, the Yam, that stitched river valleys and mountain passes into a connected realm. At each post stood spare horses, fodder, and men who knew their task. A courier carried a tablet of authority called a paisa or a gerige, often of metal or carved wood, which showed that he served the Khan's business. With that tablet he could demand a horse from a relay stable or shelter from a local chief. Orders now moved faster than any enemy could march, and news could be weighed by a ruler before gossip distorted it. Commerce and command were allowed to walk together. The Khan recognized that caravans needed protection and that his own officers needed suppliers. He entered into partnerships with merchants, often from Central Asia, who furnished goods to the army and received security and privileges in return. These men, sometimes called autoks or partners, became veins through which wealth and information flowed. A quartermaster on the Oxus and a clerk near the Caroline could read the same list of bolts of cloth and sacks of flour and know that the numbers would match when the goods arrived. The practice turned plunder into tax and tax into planned support, and it kept the army moving. With order secured behind him, Genghis tested the borders. Western Shah lay to the southwest, a Tangut realm that guarded the corner where desert, mountain, and river met. It was not as large as the Jin dynasty to the south, but it was rich in towns and in craftsmen. The Khan had measured Shah's strength during his rise, and now he measured its appetite for tribute. In 1205, his riders struck probing blows along the frontier. In 1209, he returned with a larger host. The heart of Xia was the city of Zhongxing, present-day Yinchuan, protected by strong walls and by the curves of the Yellow River. The Mongols were masters in the saddle, but walls had humbled many steppe leaders before them. Genghis refused to be humbled. He gathered engineers, some Chinese, some Khitan, and set them to work. Mangonels were built, stone throwers were dragged on wheeled platforms, sappers tested the earth near the walls. Chroniclers tell a tale that the Mongols tried to divert the Yellow River to flood the city. The earthworks failed, and the flood turned against the besiegers. But the lesson was as important as a victory. The Khan would use water, fire, and foreign skill as readily as horse and bow. After months of pressure, the Shah court asked for terms. They agreed to pay tribute, to send hostages, and to accept a marriage that would make the alliance visible. The Khan accepted their submission and withdrew. He had earned more than treasure. He had taken time and the use of a frontier that would remain quiet for several years. His attention turned to the great weight of the Jin dynasty, whose border ran like a hard line along the grasslands. In 1211, Genghis called his commanders for a campaign that no Mongol leader had attempted in a generation. The army moved toward the passes that guarded the northern plain. Scouts searched for ways through the rugged lines of the Great Wall and the mountains that buttressed it. The Mongols did not batter themselves against the strongest gates. They sought neglected tracks, bribed guides, and made use of the knowledge of subject peoples who had no love for their Jurchen overlords. Once on the plain, the army spread like water in a furrow. Columns moved with coordination that surprised their foes. Feigned retreats drew Jin forces out of fortified positions and onto ground where a storm of arrows could break them. When the Jin assembled a grand force to meet the invaders, the Mongols flowed around it and struck at supply lines. A cavalry that could cover 50 or 60 miles in a day became a tool for strategy rather than a mere terror on a village green. City after city learned the calculus of Mongol war. A garrison that opened its gates early was spared and taxed. A garrison that resisted and caused Mongol losses was broken with severe example. The policy was not sentimental. It was police work on the scale of provinces. Terror was a language that the Khan used to reduce future costs. At the same time, artisans, clerks, and scholars were protected when possible and moved north to serve the growing state. Families of craftsmen were resettled with care. Their skills were a treasure that the Khan understood and kept. Not every blow fell from the hand of Genghis himself. Mukhali, a commander of quiet stature, proved to be a pillar in the northern plains. When the Khan returned to the steppe, he left Mukhali with authority to hold and expand the Mongol position in Jin territory. Mukhali did this with patience and steel. He accepted the surrender of towns, placed Daragachi overseers to collect revenue, and used local administrators to keep granaries and courts working. In a sense, the Mongols annexed governance itself and learned to wear it with a confidence that surprised their enemies. The campaign built reputations. Jebe, the archer spared years before, showed a feel for the enemy that verged on second sight. He would press hard when a line trembled and sit like a stone when a trap invited him forward. Subutai, younger and quiet, began to find his place in the councils. He studied maps of river courses and mountain spurs and thought in terms of seasons rather than days. Together and apart, these men created a style of strike that would later sweep across half the world. Family stood within the circle of war. The Khan's sons rode in separate wings of the army so that each could learn the burden of command without constant supervision. Jochi gained a name for generosity towards surrendered communities and for a talent in managing men of mixed origin. Chagatai showed a severe sense of law that impressed soldiers and angered some allies. Ogedei proved a reconciler who could soothe disputes before they became fractures. Tolui, still the youngest, watched and learned with fierce attention. The Khan watched them all and took counsel from Bote in the privacy of the tent. He had not yet named a successor, and the question lay like a sealed jar on a shelf, noted and left closed for later. The Jin court struggled to read this new enemy. They sent enormous armies to retake towns, only to find themselves shadowboxing against riders who would not stand still. They called for southern reinforcements and moved their capital to Kaifeng when pressure mounted in the north. In 1214, a treaty was struck near Zhongdu that offered gifts and a promise that the Jin would move the court away from the front. The Khan took the gifts and observed the promise while the ink dried. When the Jin court broke obligations that had been part of the understanding, fled south, and attempted to rebuild, the Mongols returned to the siege. In 1215, Zhongdu fell. Fire and sack followed. The city that would one day be called Beijing learned what it meant to resist a people who kept a ledger of every promise kept and broken. Behind the storm stood scribes who made sense of it for the center. Uyghur clerks recorded lists of surrendered families and inventories of granaries. Persian accountants began to appear at camps and weigh the claims of merchants who supplied the army. Translators moved between Chinese, Turkic, Mongolian, and Persian with astonishing speed. The Khan listened to men who could explain the tax systems of settled states and show him how to take revenue without killing the source of it. The presence of such advisors did not make him a bureaucrat. It made him a ruler who never hesitated to use a good idea from any quarter. The army itself changed as it learned. Siege engines were now part of standard kit when a major city was the target. Fire pots were thrown with cords that whined in the air. Walls were undermined by sappers who had studied their craft in older empires. Engineers lived under Mongol protection and traveled on wagons that never lacked fodder or food. When the army struck deep into the plain, detachments rode with their own smiths, carpenters, and physicians. A corps of people who could mend bows, set bones, and repair wagons became as important as the best archers in the line. Diplomacy did not rest while the arrows flew. The Khan offered generous terms to tribes and garrisons that chose to join him early. He used marriages to bind frontier leaders to his house. He placed daughters and nieces with important allies, not as ornaments, but as governors with authority over trade routes and garrisons. Alakai Beki, married into the Ongud, ruled a strategic corridor with prudence and backed caravans with her own mounted guards. The image of a nomad horde that knew only how to burn and move began to fray. In its place appeared a state that could fight, tax, and protect. As the northern plain fell under Mongol control, the camps along the Orkhon settled into a rhythm that would shape everything that followed. Orders went out along the Yam, captives were sorted and assigned, artisans were placed where their skills could be used. New units trained under officers who knew what it meant to lose and to return to the field stronger. Winter camps were laid out with the care of towns. In the evenings, musicians played in tents where lords planned the next season. At dawn, the Keshig stood in silence as the Khan mounted. There was no sense that the work was finished. There was only the knowledge that a border had been crossed, and that beyond the Jin lay other realms that had taken no notice of the winds building on the steppe. The road to the west opened only after Genghis Khan cleared his northern flank and tested his new state against walls. Kuchlug of the Naiman, the restless prince who had fled to the lands once ruled by the Kara Kitai, had pressed Buddhist and Muslim towns with a heavy hand. Jebe rode after him through the Ili Valley, past Balasagun, and into the high country where merchant roads climbed toward the roof of the world. Kuchlug tried to make a stand among peoples weary of steppe overlords. Jebe moved light and fast, broke the resistance, and took the rebel alive, or drove him to a final flight that ended in death. The effect reached far beyond the mountains. The last claimants of the Kara Kitai order were scattered. The Mongol frontier now touched the domains of the Khwarezm Shah. Khwarezm stretched from the Aral Sea and the lower Oxus to the markets of Transoxiana, and the mountain gates of Khorasan. Its ruler, Ala al-Din Muhammad, had strength on parchment and weakness in the handling of men. His court at Gurgan shone with craft and commerce, but its inner circles were riven by rivalry, not least between the Shah and his mother, the formidable Turkin Khatun, who commanded her own network of officers and demanded a say in matters of war and tax. Where the Mongol camp had one moving center, Khwarazm had several, and they pulled in different directions. Genghis did not begin with a demand for submission. He began with trade. Caravans moved across the frontier in 1218, carrying furs, spices, and silver. At Otrar on the Sir Daria, the governor, Inalchuk, seized a caravan, accused the merchants of spying, and had them killed. The Khan sent envoys to demand redress and to remind the Shah that envoys were sacred. The Shah allowed the governor to stand and added an insult of his own. He had the beards of Mongol envoys shaved and sent one back with the news that the others had been killed. In the Mongol law, that was a crime against order itself. The decision for war followed as simply as a drawn bowstring. The assembly that planned the campaign thought in seasons and in rivers. The Oxus and the Sir Daria run across the land like blue cords. The cities that mattered sat near them, fed by irrigation and by trade. To take them required patience, engineers, and a web of movements that forced garrisons to look in several directions at once. The forces were divided by family wings and by trusted captains. Jochi moved along the lower Sir Daria with orders to break Otrar and secure the river corridor. Chagatai and Ogaday took the line toward Bukhara and Samarkand, the jewels of Transoxiana. Tolui rode south with a strong corps toward Khorasan. Jebe and Subutai ranged like hawks between these columns, scouting far ahead, cutting messengers, and seeking roads that no cautious commander would trust. Otrar fell first after a long siege. The governor who had set the flame was captured. Mongol practice was to punish the author of a crime and to turn the rest of a city to profit if it could be made to yield. Otrar's walls held for months under a rain of stones before miners and sappers opened the way. The city was torn apart and its people scattered, a warning flag at the frontier. Jochi folded the river towns one by one and made room for the main body to come on. Bukhara faced the moment with a divided heart. Its leaders had argued for caution when the Shah first dismissed Mongol envoys. Now they stood on the walls and watched dust rise to the east. The Mongols appeared where they were least expected, riding out of empty country after crossing bad lands with water in leather skins and with remounts that could endure days of short grass. Bukhara's citadel held briefly. Persian chroniclers record that the Khan spoke in the great mosque, not as a preacher, but as a conqueror who recited the consequences of stubbornness. Whether the exact words are true or colored by later memory, the meaning was plain. The city had been taken because the men who should have kept faith with their neighbors had chosen pride instead. Samarkand, richer and stronger, presented a larger test. Its walls were thick and its garrison numerous. Elephants from India stood within the gates as symbols of a ruler who had once imagined himself as a master of trade from sea to mountain. Chagatai and Ogaday encircled the place and began the work. Chinese and Khitan engineers assembled traction trebuchets and counterweight engines. Naphtha throwers built their frames. Sappers drove mines beneath towers, while archers kept defenders from the battlements with a steady stream of shafts. Several days of hard fighting loosened the resolve of the garrison. A portion of the town opened early, hoping for mercy. The citadel held on until the last, and then broke. The Mongols separated artisans and skilled workers for transport, and assigned others to officers who could make use of their labor. A court that had delayed, bickered, and then fled left its people to bear the weight alone. Shah Muhammad ran from city to city, always arriving too late to direct a defense that could hold. He fled across the Oxus, then across the desert toward the Caspian, and finally to an island where he died with a few attendants in a bitter wind. His son Jalal al-Din gathered what he could from the wreckage and would fight again later. For now, the heart of Khwarezm was taken from top to bottom. The fall of Urgench, the old Gurganj, showed how even victory could shake a camp. The city sat in a maze of canals that made movement hard. Its defenders fought with a stubborn courage that surprised the attackers. Jochi and Chagatai clashed over how to handle the place and its people. Jochi favored a negotiated surrender that would preserve wealth and lives that could be taxed and used. Chagatai demanded punishment to the limit. Their quarrel reflected old friction and the sharpness of rumor about Jochi's birth. Genghis sent Ogadai to adjudicate. Ogadai accepted the surrender when it came, and then allowed a sack that answered Chagatai's desire for a clean example. The episode did not end the argument between elder brothers. It taught the father that harmony among sons could not be taken for granted, even in the glow of triumph. Khorasan felt the next weight. Tolui brought a strong column down the river roads and into the ancient cities. Merv opened its gates. Nishapur resisted after the slaying of a Mongol officer and suffered a fearful reprisal. Herat watched and chose a cautious middle course, opening and closing in turn as local tides shifted, and paid heavily when patience ran out among the besiegers. The scale of destruction in some of these places has been debated by scholars, yet there is no doubt that the losses were dreadful and that a carpet of fear unrolled from town to town. The Mongols had mastered the minimum dose of terror that would spare them many later sieges. They used it with cold calculation, then sent caravanserai masters and tax clerks to set granaries in order. While the main armies took the cities, a drama unfolded in the mountains and passes around the Caucasus. Jebe and Subutai asked permission to pursue Jalal al-Din and to look beyond for new routes. They passed the Caspian on its eastern flank, beat a Georgian army that tried to block them, turned north along the line of the Caucasus, and forced the gates at Derbent through wit and bribes. They moved like a wind that changed direction without warning. The Cuman steppe riders fled before them and then rallied with Alan allies for a stand. The Mongol commanders sent gifts and words to the Cumans, whispered that the Alans planned to sell them if the day went badly, and split the alliance without drawing a bow. The Alans were beaten. The Cumans were hunted in turn. The lesson was the same, from the Oxus to the Black Sea. Divide your enemies, alter the map before you set the camp. The ride ended in an encounter that the Rus annals remember with anger. At the Kalka River, the princes of Kiev and their allies faced a Mongol force that had drawn them far from their centers. The fight went badly from the first exchange. Rus lines broke under a storm of arrows and a swift strike at exposed flanks. Jebe and Subutai did not stay to take possession of towns. They had ridden too far for that. They took their prisoners, made an example on a hill for all who watched, and turned back across the steppe to report what they had learned. On their route home, they fought their way through angry tribes in the lower Volga, and returned with maps in their heads and a feel for distances that would be used in full in later years. In the wake of the Western campaign came administration. Darughachi were placed in prime towns to watch revenue, and to report the behavior of local notables. Roads were patrolled. The Yam relay marched outward like a measured beat. The Khan did not invent governance. He made it portable. In Bukhara, a Persian clerk worked alongside a Uyghur scribe to reconcile taxes in wheat with taxes in silk. In Samarkand, a Muslim judge adjudicated under a Mongol seal that guaranteed his safety. In the market of Merv, a caravan master who had supplied the army at a river crossing received a monopoly grant that would carry his goods from town to town under armed escort. The web held because the punishments for breaking it were immediate, and because the profits for keeping it were visible to any man who counted coins at night. Family matters did not sleep. The quarrel between Jochi and Chagatai grew into something that required a decision. Genghis convened a family council on the banks of the Ili after the main weight of the Khwarezm War had passed. He named Ogedei as heir, not because he was the strongest fighter, but because he could speak to both camps and keep peace long enough for the greater work to continue. Jochi was given the lands of the far west as his share, rich in pasture and in future war. Fate would cut that story short, for Jochi would die before his father and his sons would carry his rights into new quarrels. For the moment, a settlement was set and men returned to their assignments. Genghis himself moved south against Jalal al-Din, who had rallied in the Punjab. On the banks of the Indus, they fought a battle where the river ran broad and green. Jalal al-Din showed the kind of courage that had made men love him. He fought until the lines closed, then rode his horse into the river and swam under a hail of arrows to the far bank. The Khan watched from a height and praised the man openly. He would have kept him as a vassal if pride and the memory of a dead empire had allowed it. Jalal al-Din rode into exile. The Mongol army did not cross into the heart of India. It had done what it set out to do. It had dismantled a rival state and shown that there was no distance beyond its reach. The Western War taught the Mongols to fight in deserts and in gardens, on walls and on plains, among canals and in mountain passes. It introduced them to oil fires and to the sweet skills of potters and smiths whose fingers could make what steppe camps could not. It enriched them with a traffic of ideas and a load of sorrow. Persian poets would mourn these years for generations. Chinese clerks took notes on the methods that made the engine run. The Khan began to think that a ruler who could shatter and assemble on this scale might fix the borders of the world itself. In a winter tent near the Orkhon, the great captains returned and laid their gear by the door. Jebe spoke little and traced routes in ashes with a stick. Subutai measured out distances with his fingers. Mukhali sent steady reports from the north of China. The sons of the house sat and said what they had done and what they had learned. Borte listened and kept her counsel for a private hour. Holun looked at her grandsons and thought of the years when a rabbit snared at dusk had meant survival. Outside, the Yam riders changed horses and vanished into the dark with new orders. The wind carried the smell of dung fires and of iron quenched in cold water. Across the mountains to the southwest lay a realm that had sued for peace and then tested patience once too often. The steppe had not finished with it. When the western banners began to fold and the dust of Transoxiana settled behind the horsetails, Genghis Khan turned his face again to the sunrise. He had broken a proud empire beside the Oxus. He had sent Jebe and Subutai across a sweep of country that few men in his camp had ever imagined, as far as the Black Sea and the plains of the Rus. He had seen caravan masters from Khorasan counting coins under Mongol seals, and he had received the submission of towns that once thought nomads were only a storm that passes and is gone. Yet in the reports that reached him by the Yam, there was a steady pulse from the east that could not be ignored. Western Xia had bent the knee years before and then stiffened. Jin power had retreated south, yet still stood. The border towns watched and weighed their choices. The Khan would not allow hesitation to harden into defiance. He returned to the Orkhon with the camp grown larger and more complex than the one he had left. The Keshig had become a school of command. The relay posts stretched farther than a man could ride in a week. Uyghur scribes sat near the center tent with bundles of bamboo slips and sheaves of paper, and with inkstones and brushes that had become as necessary to rule as the bow was to war. Persian clerks who had followed the army east from Bukhara worked the ledgers of merchant partners and balanced their advances against promised deliveries of grain and cloth and salt. A Khitan scholar named Yelu Chukai stood at the edge of councils and spoke in a voice that was quiet and stubborn. He had served the Khitan Liao in his youth and had read histories that measured the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties. He did not tell the Khan to be merciful, because mercy wins praise. He told him to tax because taxes fill granaries and pay soldiers for more than one season. Kill and you take tribute for a day. Count and you take revenue for a generation. The advice suited a ruler who had learned to use any tool that worked. Genghis did not stop fighting. He learned when to stop destroying. The family that anchored the tent had changed as well. Jochi had been given the lands of the far west, rich in pasture and promise. The quarrel with Chagatai had cooled in public under the decision that named Ogedei as heir. Tolui remained closest to his father in the field and had become the hand that tightened a siege when others flagged. Borte watched her sons with a clear eye and had the kind of gravity that holds men steady. Holun, older now and surrounded by grandchildren, remembered years when a snared marmot had kept death from the door and saw in the quiet order of the winter camp a wonder that few would grasp if they had not tasted hunger. Before the army moved, the Khan finished work that would give shape to what followed. The decimal organization became the structure of the realm and not only of the host. Leaders of thousands and tens of thousands were expected to judge disputes as well as to ride. Darugachi, overseers chosen for diligence and probity, were planted like posts in towns that had accepted Mongol rule. Their business was not to invent laws from scratch, but to keep the promises the center had made. If a city had opened its gates early, that fact was recorded and protection was given as a matter of honor. If merchants had supplied horse fodder at a river crossing, their tablets were checked and their privileges renewed. If a governor had cheated on shares of the tax, the punishment was visible and quick. The yasa was not a code that one could pull from a shelf. It was the continuing voice of a ruler who wanted soldiers to feel that their backs were watched, merchants to feel that their contracts would be honored, and envoys to feel that they could cross frontiers without fear. The Western Ride had taught the Mongols that engineers were as useful as archers when a city sat behind good walls. Craftsmen were gathered into a moving core that could raise a counterweight engine in days, build ladders and shields, and mine beneath a gate and set fire to the props at the right moment. A unit of watermen traveled with them, men from lands where canals were old and precious. If a river could be turned to flood a wall, it would be tried. If it failed, the failure would be studied and another method applied. That habit of close attention made the difference between a raider and a conqueror. In the second decade of the century, the attention of the court turned to Western Xia. Years before, when Genghis first tested its strength, the Tangut court at Zhongxing had paid tribute and sent hostages. They had accepted a marriage that bound them to the Mongol camp and had promised support when called. As the empire grew and the distance from the Orkhon to the Oxus stretched the lines of command, Shah nobles had calculated that the moment for caution had passed. They failed to send troops when summoned. They dealt with the south in terms that suggested they imagined a future without Mongol suzerainty. There was a grievance that cut deeper than calculation. Envoys had again been harmed. To raise a hand against a messenger was to challenge the basic order that the Khan believed heaven had given him to keep. He resolved to ride. The route to Zhongxing lay along the long corridor of Gansu, where mountains press the desert and towns cling to rivers that farmers had guided for centuries. Subutai rode in one wing, with orders to move fast and to sow confusion along the line of towns that the Tangut court relied upon. Tolui took another wing and made sure that garrisons could not gather in confidence behind him. Genghis moved with the main weight. Mongol columns crossed stretches of gravel and sand that other armies avoided in summer. They chose to cross in late autumn and winter, when heat could not grind a horse to a walk, and when the cold sharpened riders rather than crippling them. People in the towns along the Ezhin and Xiang rivers looked up one morning to see dust clouds where none should have been, and riders where no sensible general would send them. At Haishui City and at Liangzhou, the Mongols tried every door. A city that opened early kept its craftsmen and handed over grain. A city that fired on envoys saw mangonels raised and heard stones hum through the air. Subutai cut roads that linked towns to province and province to capital. Caravans that once had run from west to east with silk and paper and worked metal now carried reports and wounded men back to Zhongxing. The court sent pleas for help in all directions and gathered what it could in the Helan Mountains to make a last line. Lingwu, which stood on the Yellow River, became the next keystone. To take it was to step across a threshold into the heartland of the Tangut. The Mongols tested the walls, found their strengths, and then applied what they had learned in China. Sappers undermined towers. Engine crews aimed at the same point for hours and then changed fire at the order of a single flag so that their stones fell where the shock would be greatest. When a breach opened, the first men through were not left to die as a lesson. They were supported and then relieved, and the fight moved inward like a tide. When Lingwu fell, the court in Zhongxing felt the grip close. The defense of Western Xia did not fail only because the Mongols were relentless. It failed because the Tangut court was a noisy place where men with rank argued as if victory could be found within a sentence. Factions that had quarreled in easier times still quarreled now. One party wanted to flee and rebuild in more distant valleys. Another wanted to trust the walls. Another wanted to beg for terms that would preserve noble privileges. The ruler sent messages that said different things to different men. In the Mongol camp, the words from Zhongxing were read for what they were. They were the speech of a court that hoped time would help it. The Khan had learned to use time for himself. He pushed past the Helan buttress and rode into the arc of the Yellow River where Zhongxing sat. The city had fine earthworks and ditches that snared horse hooves, and it had engineers of its own who understood the flight of stones and the setting of fires. The Mongol camps were laid out beyond bow range and then drew inward as work progressed. The engine park grew, a forest of frames and cords and counterweights. A steady rain of messages moved between the tents of the commanders. Tolui managed the siege lines with his quiet hardness. Subutai ranged around the ring and made sure no rescue could break through. The Khan himself moved on a slow circuit from point to point, speaking with leaders of hundreds and of thousands, steadying their impatience. He did not promise early victory. He promised to stay until the work was done. There is an old story that the Mongols tried again to turn the Yellow River against the city. The river is not a pet. It obeys no plan for long. The attempt did not decide the siege, but it did show a habit that would not leave the Mongol mind. If a natural force could be made to serve, it would be tried. When water failed, fire was used. When fire failed, the slow bite of mines and rams ate at the same points with stubborn repetition. In these months, a blow fell within the family that closed one path and opened others. News came that Jochi was dead far in the west. He had ruled his appanage with a measured hand, had shown generosity towards surrendered cities, and had held the loyalty of men who had once ridden against him. The rumor that had dogged his birth had never been killed. It surfaced even now that his body could not be brought east, and it stained the talk of those who never liked him. Chagatai and his captains were careful with their words. Ogedei spoke softly. Tolui kept to his work at the siege. Genghis received the news and went into a private tent with Borte. They spoke as a man and a woman who had outlasted hunger and war, and who had learned that even a Khan cannot command the span of a life. When he stepped out, the camp saw no change in his pace. Orders continued to go out. The work did not slow. Yet those who knew him well afterward said that a line had drawn across his face that did not lift. The last phase at Zhongxing took the form that many sieges take when defenders have run out of choices. The court asked for terms and offered submission. The Khan demanded that the ruler come in person to make it good. The ruler sent a son and words. The Khan said he would accept nothing less than the person of the man who had failed to keep past oaths. The ruler would not come. The engines fired again. A portion of the wall collapsed. Assault ladders went up with their rungs slick from many hands. When the city fell, the ruler was taken and punished. The dynasty ended. Its best engineers and craftsmen were gathered and moved. Its archives were sorted. Its court poets were scattered to the winds. During the long investment, an accident altered the last pages of the Khan's life. He was no longer a young man running down a gazelle across the flats. He still hunted to keep his senses sharp. In one of those hunts, or on a ride between positions at the siege, he fell from his horse. Some said he broke bones that did not set well. Others said he took a fever from another cause, or that the strain of years had found the moment to show itself. Later storytellers embroidered the matter with tales of plots and of insults dressed as love, the kind of stories that gather around a great death, like crows around a camp. The truth that matters is simpler. He began to fail. He did not call off the siege. He ordered that the work continue to its end and that the punishment of the Tangut house be complete. He called his sons. He confirmed again in their hearing that Ogedei would be Khan after him. He told them to finish the business in the north of China and then to turn to whatever frontier pressed most hard. He told them to guard the yam and to keep the lists, to protect envoys, to use merchants as partners, and to remember Baljuna, where loyalty had been tested in mud and cold and found true. He spoke to Tolui about the work of holding the center while the succession was carried through the proper assembly. He spoke to Borte in private and thanked her in words that no clerk set down. The death came away from the city, perhaps in the Liupan Mountains where he had moved for cleaner air. The Keshig covered the news as one covers a fire from wind. The camp functioned as if nothing had changed. Engines were still fed, messages were still carried, The last ruler of Western Xia was dealt with as ordered. When the body could move, an escort began the long journey north. There is a legend, told many ways, that the escort killed every passerby to keep the route secret, that the horses were turned over the place where the grave would lie to erase the signs, that a forest was planted over the resting place so that roots and branches would guard it. There is another legend that says a river was turned and that the waters hide him. The elders of the Borjigin say only that he was taken toward Burkhan Khaldun and that the place is not marked. He had told his sons that a king of the steppe did not need a stone to tell men where to bow. He needed only their memory and their obedience. The funeral rites were simple and sacred to men of the grass. The black tug banners were furled and the white ones lifted. Horses were led in circles around a mound of earth that did not declare itself. Shamans spoke to the eternal blue sky and asked it to receive a soul that had altered the course of peoples and rivers. Men who had shared mare's milk with him at Baljuna stood with heads bowed and remembered the taste of muddy water on their tongues. Women who had wrapped their children in cloaks against winter winds wept for a ruler who had made the roads safe enough for caravans to move under guard from one horizon to another. The horses were turned to the north, and then to the south, and then to the east and the west, and the army knew that it would ride again, because the dead man had said that the work was not a fire that could be put out. In the east, Mughali still held the Mongol position in the north of China, with patience that impressed even enemies. He had organized many counties and prefectures under Mongol seals, and had used local administrators to keep tax registers current. Some towns still stood against him. Some reopened their gates after a change of governor or a quarrel among court factions. The path laid down by the Khan would allow his successors to finish what he had begun. The Jin court had already fled from Zhongdu to Kaifeng in the south, a move that could not hide the erosion of their power. The commanders knew that they would return. For the present, the army gathered around the family and waited for the assembly that would raise Ogedai to the place the father had promised him. The last camp of Genghis Khan did not empty at once. It paused for the time that custom requires when a great one goes. Distant princes were summoned to the assembly. Messengers rode along the Yam with tablets that opened doors. The Keshig stood watch over a tent where no voice called for a horse at dawn. In the workshops of the engineers, men rubbed the dirt from their hands and set tools in order. In the tents of the scribes, brushes were cleaned and lists tied up with cord. In the tents of the women, garments were mended. The wind moved across the Orkhon and through the grass around the stones of an older age, the deer stones and balbals that marked someone's dead from centuries before. The steppe had absorbed empires and would absorb this news as it had absorbed so many things. What it would not absorb was the habit of order that had been planted there and watered with sweat and blood. When the escort reached the north and the grave had its guard of silence, men rose from the mourning bench and saddled their ponies. Ogedai would be raised in proper assembly. Tolui would hold the center until the rites were finished. Chagatai would speak harshly, as was his habit, and then keep faith. The sons of Yochi, Batu among them, would wait and watch to see what task the new Khan would assign them. Subutai would unroll maps and point first toward the passes and then toward the rivers. Yelu Chukai would bring out a set of figures and recommend a levy that would not break the fields and a law that would not drive merchants to bribery. In the west and in the south, there were rulers who thought the old order would return now that the first storm had passed. They had not grasped what had changed. The army moved again. not yet toward an enemy, but toward a place beside a river where men would speak the words that knit families and captains into one will. In the circles of tents, elders told the young what they had seen. They spoke of the day of the sable-coat in Togrul's camp. They spoke of a dawn raid, when the Merkit took a wife, and the answer came swift and sure. They spoke of Baljuna, and of Dalan Baljut, where they had lost and then learned. They spoke of Jongdu, and of the Oxus, and of the Kalka River. They spoke now of Zhongxing, and the river at Lingwu, and of a fall from a saddle that had shaken them more than any battle. They did not give these tales the shape of a conclusion. They gave them the shape of the road that lay ahead. The death of Genghis Khan did not leave a vacant sky. It left instructions, obligations, and men who had lived long enough under his will to know how the next steps should look. The tent of mourning stood, guards changed in silence, and messengers rode along the relay lines. From the Orkhon to the Oxus, and from the forests of the north to the border towns of the south, the word spread that a great assembly would be held to raise a new ruler. Those who had authority over thousands made their way in, along with princes of the house and envoys from allied tribes who wished to be seen near the fire when the decision was made. The Kurultai met in the late summer of the second year after his death. In the presence of elders, captains, and notables from many peoples, the sons of the founder took their places. Chagatai spoke with the force that had always been his, direct and sharp as a spear point. The sons of Jochi sat with their followers and watched the tone of the gathering. Tolui kept order as steward of the house. The choice had been prepared in private by their father, and in public by the way that each son had behaved across years of war. Ogadai's manner was open. He was a man who could drink deep and laugh loudly, and he could also listen and say yes to a compromise that kept men at the table. He did not carry the harsh pride that had set Chagatai against Jochi. He was not a patient clerk, but he understood the value of clerks. When the elders made their speech, and the ranks shouted as one, Ogadai was lifted and declared Great Khan. There is a habit among peoples who live by herds to judge a leader first by generosity. Ogadai began by opening the storehouses and giving. Horses went to captains who had worn out their mounts on long rides. Robes and belts were handed to men whose loyalty had been tested. Gifts traveled outward to allied tribes and to distant vassals. The new ruler made it clear that a Khan who holds back in a season of festivity will find his following thin in a season of need. Gifts were not the whole of his policy. They were the beginning of a tone that said, the center is strong enough to be open-handed. Karakoram rose from that tone and from the practical need for a place where messengers could always find the court. Ogadai chose the Orkhon Valley, not far from ancient stone steles that bore runes left by Turkic rulers long dead. The site had grass and fish and timber in reach, and it sat at a crossroads of the Yam lines. The new city was not a stone forest in the manner of Chinese capitals. It was a planned camp that became a town. Workshops were laid out for smiths, bowmakers, carpenters, and potters. Storehouses lined the river. A palace of timber rose, with beams carved by artisans drawn from conquered cities. Markets were set aside for Muslims, for Chinese, and for other merchants who preferred to bargain among those who shared their customs. A tree of silver stood in the palace yard, a fountain crafted by a French artisan brought east by merchants that poured wine and mare's milk and mead for feasts. The device was a piece of theatre and a declaration that strange talents would be welcome if they served the court. Administration flowed more smoothly when it had tables and chairs and walls to keep the wind off the ledgers. Yelu Chukai found in Ogede a ruler willing to trust a man who spoke for measured taxation in place of endless seizure. The Khitan scholar argued for registers of households and fields, for counted granaries and fixed levies that would be collected by officials who feared the center more than they feared town notables. He proposed that officials take assessed shares in salt, grain, and cloth rather than in the lives of taxpayers. Ogede listened. He did not want to be loved by farmers. He wanted a river of predictable goods and coin that could be sent along the Yam to armies in the field. Under Yelu Chukai, the early system of quotas and requisitions took a shape that ministers could defend with numbers. Abuse did not disappear. It became more visible. Those who cheated could be named, punished, and replaced. The relay system itself grew into a web over continents. Posts stood a day's ride apart along major lines, with spare mounts and fodder and a clerk who could stamp a tablet to show that a courier had taken a horse. Farmers and towns were assessed to support the posts, but the burden was spread and accounted. A message could leave Karakoram in the morning and pass through hands that would carry it across the Gobi and down into the valleys of North China in a matter of days, not weeks. Travelers with Pisa tablets moved under protection. A caravan master who had served the court as a partner could demand shelter and oats. A monk with a letter from a governor could cross 3 languages in 1 week without being robbed. The roads became the empire's most durable invention. The army did not stand idle while clerks sharpened their brushes. Mukali, the old pillar, had died with honors after holding the northern plain. New pillars rose. The campaign against the Jin resumed with clear objectives. The Jin court had fled to Kaifeng and then farther south, hoping that distance and allies would stall the northern riders. Ogede and Tolui planned a series of advances that would break the remaining resistance and teach the southern song that the north would not become a buffer forever. The Mongol armies crossed the frozen Yellow River in winter, their ponies sure-footed on ice that cracked under heavier animals. They used siege engines built by Chinese and Khitan crews who now worked as part of the standard train. At Kaifeng, the Jin faced a storm they could not turn. Naphtha bombs exploded with a sound that startled even steppe veterans. Fire lances spat flame from the walls in a last effort to keep the besiegers back. Famine followed fire as stocks ran short. The Jin emperor fled again. In the year that Chinese annals place as 1234, Jin rule ended when Mongols and Song together broke the last remnant. Alliances rarely hold once the shared enemy is gone. The Song soon learned that the new rulers of the north were not content to let the Huai River be a permanent border. Before the southern question could be settled, the west called. The lands assigned to the sons of Jochi remained a zone of opportunity and risk. Batu, son of Jochi, spoke for the line that had graze rights from the Irtish to the lower Volga. He was not the eldest in the family, but he had patience, a large following, and the rare talent for working with a man like Subutai without envy. Subutai had returned from the long eastern ride, with maps in his head of rivers and passes that led into the heart of Europe. Ogede decided to strike in force to clear the Chipchak steppe, to punish the Cumans who had raided subject peoples, and to test the cities beyond the forests that had heard only rumors of men who could move an army for months without running out of mounts. The muster was enormous by the standards of the steppe. Princes of the house gathered with their tumans. Giyuk came as son of the great Khan. Mungke came as eldest son of Tolui. Kadan came from the house of Ogadai. Ordu came from the house of Jochi. The army moved in wings that could separate by 100 miles and still strike the same point on the same day. Subutai traced the line across the Ural foothills, through the Volga Bend, and into the forest belt beyond the open plain. Winter was chosen for the crossings of major rivers, because ice turned water into road, and because surprise lived under snow. The first blows fell on the Volga Bulgars and the cities of the lower Volga. Then the wings turned toward the west. Polovtsian riders were scattered. The Cumans ran and then formed, and then ran again. The princes of the Rus gathered in uneasy councils, proud men who found it hard to agree on anything, except that they disliked one another's claims. The Mongols did not wait for unity. They took town after town along the upper Volga and the Oka, tested walls with engines brought on sledges, and moved on when a place yielded at the first demand. The spring of 1241 found one wing in Poland and another in Hungary. Subutai sent a diversion under Baidar and Kadan through Lesser Poland to draw Western princes away from the main effort. Krakow was burned when it resisted. At Legnica, the Duke of Silesia drew knights and burghers and a contingent of Teutonic brothers for a stand. The Mongols used smoke and feigned flight to pull the line apart, then struck the broken parts with speed. The Duke fell. European chroniclers wrote of heads on lances and of banners carried in triumph. The diversion accomplished its purpose. It kept Western forces from joining the King of Hungary on the Danube plain. Batu and Subutai forced the Carpathians by more than one road and poured into the Hungarian heartland. The king, Bela, had tried to set his host in the security of a marshy island near the Sajo River, trusting that a single bridge could be held. The Mongols built two. Under cover of night, they carried timbers and rope, drove piles quietly into the mud, and made a crossing where scouts reported the river to be shallow. At dawn, they attacked the known bridge with noise and show, while Subutai sent a weight of horse across the hidden structures to fall on the Hungarian flank and rear. Arrows did their work. Panic did the rest. The camp broke. The plain near a village later remembered as Mohi was thick with dead and with loot. The army did not stop. It hunted remnants across the country and then turned south to strike at Croatia and Dalmatia. European statesmen looked at maps and did not know how to speak of an invader who used winter as a friend and who built bridges in one night where locals needed a season. While Europe reeled, Ogadai died in Karakorum after a winter of heavy drinking and a fever that could not be turned. A great empire that had learned to move with the speed of a courier now learned the price of custom. The princes in the west were bound by the rule that a new great Khan must be chosen in assembly. Batu had no love for Gayuk and would not submit to him outside a proper Kurultai. Gayuk would not accept that Batu had acted only as a dutiful son of Jochi. Subutai argued for a winter campaign into the heart of Austria and beyond. The order came to withdraw. The army turned east. Chroniclers in Germany and Italy breathed relief and spoke of angels who had saved Christendom. The truth was more human and more Mongol. A law that held princes together required that the house come home to choose a head. Before the next head could be chosen, the empire continued to change shape. Tolui had died earlier after a ritual that offered his life to save Ogadai from a serious illness. His widow, Sorogatani Beki, took guardianship of her sons with a skill that impressed even men who did not wish to praise a woman. She secured for them tutors in languages and law, showed them how to respect clerics of many faiths, and taught them to let servants of talent do their work without fear. She did not attend councils as a figurehead. she managed alliances with care. When Giyuk was raised as Great Khan after a period of regency by his mother Toregin, it was Sorghetani who protected the interests of her sons without public quarrel. Giyuk ruled with a stiffness that offended Batu and alarmed some ministers. He died on patrol in the west, before he could force a settlement that might have broken the house. All the while, the administrative habits planted by Genghis and refined by Ogadai kept the engine running. Darugachi wrote to Karakoram about tax shortfalls and floods. The yam ran despite war and despite quarrels among princes. Ortok merchants funded caravans with advances from the court and were paid back with shares of tolls. Craftsmen who had been gathered from Zhongdu and Kaifeng built engines in Samarkand and Bukhara, a cannon of ideas fired from every direction. Paper money was studied where it had taken root in the south. Gunpowder recipes moved with engineers and found their way into the notebooks of men who wrote in Syriac and in Arabic. A surgeon from Persia discussed cautery with a Chinese physician, and both observed that a saddle sore on a good pony was a greater problem to a campaign than any theory about humors. In North China, the war against the Song began in earnest. The Song Navy commanded great rivers and had shipyards that could turn out war junks in impressive numbers. The Mongols learned to fight on water by hiring pilots from subject peoples and by forcing surrendered shipwrights to train new crews. At one moment, a Song admiral named Yu Yunwen gained a striking victory on the Yangtze, with fire ships and a firm chain across the current. Mongol commanders took the lesson, rebuilt their rivercraft, and then used winter ice and low water to bring engines against river towns that had believed themselves safe. Within the house, the division of lands that had begun as appanages took on clearer shape. The Jochid realm in the western steppe matured into a khanate that Europeans would later call the Golden Horde. It turned fur, fish, and traffic along the Volga into wealth and directed raids and diplomacy toward the Black Sea and the Balkans. The Chagatai realm in Transoxiana held the trade routes between Samarkand and Kashgar and became a court where Turkic and Mongol customs interwove. The Toluid branch, anchored in Mongolia and in North China, held the seat at Karakoram and the main claim to the title of Great Khan. Lines that began as family allotments became borders where different balances of custom and law settled over time. The center still commanded, but it commanded through men who had their own interests and who learned to mask those interests in speeches about service to the house. Ogadai's reign thus drew two great lines on the map. One ran south through Jin territory into Songlands. The other ran west with Batu and Subutai across rivers and forests. The first line required siegecraft and long patience. The second required winter marches, bridges on piles, and a mind that could imagine striking 3 fortified towns in a single day by using wings that had not seen one another for a week. The postal system and the merchant partnerships bound both lines to the center. The legal rules about envoys made it possible for these lines to talk. The habit of raising able men, whether they were born under felt or in a walled town, kept the lines from fraying when one pillar died. When men think of the age of Genghis, they often see only gallop and fire. The age of Ogadai added something less visible and just as potent. It added rhythm. Orders went out from Karakoram at dawn. Reports returned at dusk. Merchants planned their caravans for the seasons when grass would be richest near relay posts. Judges kept days for hearing disputes and for recording settlement. Captains trained new units through winter so that spring did not require teaching horses and men at once. A boy in the Keshig learned where to stand in a council, and when to speak, and when to hold his tongue. A girl married into the Ongud learned that she could send a message to the center with a clerk and expect an answer before the season turned. The men who sat by the fire at night and polished arrowheads spoke more often now of roads than of borders. They could ride from the Altai to the Caspian without fear of being robbed by highwaymen. They could deliver a letter from Karakorum to Bukhara and expect a reply within a span that made planning possible. They could ask a Persian merchant for lamps and see them arrive in a month or two under armed guard. That is what empire feels like to those who live within it. It feels like a road that does not break. The voice that had named Ogadai as heir still carried in the counsels of his sons and nephews. Yet empire is not a garment that passes with a single gesture. It lives by constant decisions. After the death of Ogadai, a woman kept the center from tearing. Torigene, his principal wife, held the seals as regent, while a new Kurultai could be called. She used gifts and threats to collect support for her son. Giuk was lifted as Great Khan and took his place in the felt court at Karakorum. His reign was brief and taut. He pushed administrators and princes hard and drank as if he meant to race his own heart. He died while on the road toward the west, where he intended to chastise Batu of the house of Jochi. The center trembled again and then steadied under another woman. Ogul Kaimish kept the title of regent, but could not hold the loyalties that mattered. Facing her, and gathering strength without parade, stood a queen whose tact and learning impressed both allies and rivals. Sorkatani, widow of Tolui and mother of Monka, Kublai, Hulegu, and Arik Bokeh, educated her sons in languages and law, kept faith with clerics of many religions, and placed able tutors near each boy. When the Kurultai met in the year that Persian and Chinese chronicles both mark carefully, Monka was raised as Great Khan. He began with a purge of those who had abused the trust of the house. Men who had sold offices or shaken peasants with illegal levies were removed without ceremony. The line of Tolui had grasped the reins. Monka ruled with a steady gravity. He did not love wine as his uncle had. He loved lists, accurate reports, and commanders who could plan a season at a time. He kept Yelu Chukai's emphasis on registration and measured taxation. He promoted men who took bribes from no one. Then he opened 2 doors at once. One door faced the south toward the Song, who still held the richest basins of China. The other opened to the west, toward the remains of the Khwarazm world, toward the castles of the Nizari, who had once cut down viziers in crowded bazaars, and toward the cities of the Caliph on the Tigris. Hulegu, the 3rd son of Tolui, received orders to move west with a great host. Engineers and sappers, siege masters and Persian accountants, Armenian laborers and Georgian carpenters, all marched under the horsehair standards. The castles of the Nizari fell one by one as stone-eaters gnawed at their foundations. At Alamut, their libraries were catalogued and some books preserved by secretaries who valued learning even in war. From there, the army moved to the Tigris. Baghdad had been a lighthouse for scholars and poets for centuries. It stood at a bend in the river with dikes and a population large enough to fill fields with grain and markets with cloth from many lands. Hulegu sent envoys to demand submission. The Caliph answered with confidence that grew from old prestige and not from the number of armored men he could put on a wall. The Mongol lines tightened. Stone throwers spoke day and night. On a winter day, the defenses cracked. the city was taken. The sack that followed was heavy even by the cruel arithmetic of that age. Historians who walked among the ruins in later years attempted to count the dead and could only say that the Tigris ran black with ink from broken libraries and red from the blood of the fallen. A new court rose in the west at Maraga and then at Tabriz. There Hulagu placed scholars under a roof with brass instruments. The astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi built an observatory that brought Chinese star tables into conversation with Greek and Persian theories. A Mongol court had created a house where new knowledge could be made. Power answers power. In the north, the ruler of the western steppe had become a Muslim. Burke of the House of Jochi felt the fall of Baghdad as an affront and watched Hulagu with cold eyes. The friendship that had bound branches of the family bent. Burke found common cause with the Mamluks of Egypt, who had formed an army from freed slaves and turned them into masters of Cairo and of Syria. A year after Hulagu had cut the caliphate, a Mongol detachment remained in Syria to hold ground while the main army rebuilt in the east. The Mamluks marched under Qutuz and Baibars and met them at a spring called Ain Jalut. There, on a hot September day, the Mamluks used steppe tricks against steppe veterans. They feigned retreat, drew the enemy into open ground, and struck from cover with fresh cavalry and a dust storm of arrows. The Mongol commander Kitbuka fell. The spell of invincibility broke in the Levant. While Hulagu grappled with revolt and famine in Iran, Burke's riders crossed the Caucasus and fought Ilkhanid detachments along the Terek. Nephews and cousins killed one another for the first time on a large scale. The house of Genghis had become more than a family. It had become states with interests that did not align. In the east, Monka pressed hard on the Song. He required grain, shipyards, and a sustained push along river lines. He gave to Kublai the northern theater and told Arik Bokeh to keep the heartland steady. The armies captured city after city along the Great River. Chinese engineers built floating bridges and mobile towers. When a defender sent fire ships down a current, staunchers and barges broke the attack. Monka himself took the field against Sichuan and died during the campaign, perhaps of disease, perhaps of exhaustion. His death released the tension that had held the house together. Kublai was proclaimed Great Khan in the north at Chengdu. Arik Bokeh was proclaimed in Karakoram with the support of many princes of the homeland. A civil war followed that carried messengers and lances across the spine of Asia. Kublai won by wearing his brother down through distance, supply, and the slow squeeze of politics. Arik Bokeh yielded and died a prisoner. Kublai set his capital at Khan Balik, the city of the Khan, present-day Beijing, and declared a new dynasty with a Chinese name. Yuan was written on seals and banners, and the court took on the burdens and privileges of Chinese emperors. Kublai was a different kind of ruler from his grandfather. He kept the decimal organization of the army and honored the tassels of horsehair that had marked his house since its earliest days. Yet he became a man who read memorials from Chinese scholars and replied in neat phrases. He ordered the Grand Canal repaired so that grain could flow from the rice fields of the south to the warehouses of the capital. He printed paper money in volume and insisted that markets accept it, backing it with grain reserves and with tax receipts. He built granaries to steady the price of food in lean years. He hosted envoys from Venice and from the Pope, and listened to a friar named William of Rubruck talk about the shape of the earth and the difference between Greek and Latin rites. He received a Venetian merchant family whose son would later write a book that fed the imagination of Europe for centuries. The palace at Dadu had a mix of lords in its halls that no earlier Chinese court had seen. Mongols, Uyghurs, Turks, Tibetans, Persians, and Chinese served together. They did not forget who they were. They learned how to work in one house. The conquest of the Southern Song tested every lesson the empire had learned. The Song had fine ships with ribbed hulls, drilled crews, and ministers who knew how to supply an army by water when roads were few. Kublai built a navy. He took surrendered shipwrights and ordered them to teach other peoples how to build rivercraft that could mount engines and carry archers. He advanced along the Yangtze and then into the lakes and channels of the lower basin. Year by year, the Mongol and allied forces ate away at the list of Song strongholds. At last, a fleet fight decided the line. Off the headlands near Yarman, the last Song forces gathered with the boy emperor and a loyal minister named Lu Shufu. The Mongol admiral Zhang Hongfan pressed the attack. The Song ships were chained together to prevent flight. Firepots leaped between decks. The wind faltered and betrayed the defenders. Lu Shufu wrapped the child in his arms and stepped into the sea. With that act, the last dynasty of the south ended, and the whole of China stood under the rule of the house that had begun on the Onan. Kublai's attention wandered beyond China to seas and forests that the elders of the steppe had only heard about. He sent fleets to Japan with Korean shipwrights and Chinese crews. The first armada reached the islands and fought on the beaches, then broke under a sudden storm. The second, larger than the first, came years later and met the same fate. Japanese chroniclers called the storms divine winds. The truth that mattered to Kublai was plainer. Ships built in haste and filled with men who did not share a language had limits when a typhoon swept across a bay. He sent armies into the heat of Southeast Asia, to Pagan and to Champa, and to the rice fields of Dai Viet. In each case, he could take a capital and dictate terms. In each case, the jungle and monsoon and stubborn local will turn victories into negotiations and then into uneasy stalemates. No rider can gallop in a mangrove swamp. The empire learned that reach is not the same as grasp. While the Tuluid branch shaped China, the other branches found their own rhythms. The Golden Horde of the Jochid House set its capital at Sarai on the lower Volga. There, the Volga and Don formed a hinge between open country and wooded river lanes. The Horde managed the Russian principalities through charters that named a Grand Prince and gave him the right to collect tribute for the Khan. A prince traveled to Sarai to receive the patent, the Yalik, and returned with enough prestige to cow rivals. Some rulers, like Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod and Vladimir, learned to work within this order and to use it to keep their towns safe from neighbors. Caravans moved to and from the Black Sea with guard patrols. Trade in furs and wax and grain grew. Over time, the Horde's rulers embraced Islam, and mosques stood near the markets where Italian merchants kept warehouses. The Horde was a state of the steppe and of the river both. In Iran, the Ilkhanate dealt with wounds left by the fall of Baghdad and with famine and revolt. Under Abaka and then under Ghazan, the court adopted Islam and made a great effort to knit the country together. Rashid al-Din, a Jew by birth who had become a Muslim and a physician, rose to be vizier and wrote a vast history that sought to bring Chinese, Indian, Islamic, and Mongol strands into a single narrative. He sent for reports from governors and travelers across the empire to complete this universal history. The Ilkhanid mint struck coins with new weights and designs, and tried and failed with a paper currency that lacked the administration to support it. The Maragha Observatory drew star tables that influenced work from Damascus to Samarkand. Between these western states and Kublai's Yuan stood the realm of the Chagatai. There, princes balanced Turkic customs and the legal habits of the Mongol center. Kaidu, a grandson of Ogedei, refused to accept Kublai's supremacy and waged a long war across Central Asia that kept roads in peril and taxed the strength of both courts. The conflict taught another lesson in the politics of distance. No single man could now command effortless obedience across the whole sweep of the lands that Genghis had conquered. Each branch guarded its own capital and spoke of unity while measuring the interests of its own pastures and markets. Through all of this, the instruments built in the first generation did not fall idle. The Yam continued to move orders and reports between capitals. Envoys still carried Pisa tablets and expected that doors would open to them. Merchants maintained partnerships with governors and with princes, and supplied armies with flour, rope, and iron as they had in the days of the founder. The decimal organization of troops remained the skeleton on which campaigns were built. Law still protected the messenger and punished the man who stole a horse from a relay post. Clerics of many faiths continued to travel without fear of petty officials. On the roads of the empire, a Franciscan friar could drink fermented mare's milk in a tent one week and eat pilaf in a Persian caravanserai the next, and then bow before a Chinese magistrate who wore a silk robe. The empire did not make all of these places the same. It made it possible to move between them with greater safety than any traveler in earlier centuries could have expected. Exchange runs both ways. Paper learned in China traveled west. Gunpowder formulas moved along the same routes and changed how sieges were fought in the Levant and in Europe. Artistic motifs from Iran and from China met in glazed tiles that decorated palaces from Tabriz to Dadu. Medical knowledge crossed lines of language. A doctor who read Avicenna learned to value pulse and urine from Chinese practice and added those observations to his own lists. Officials in the Yuan learned from Persian accountants how to build centralized ledgers that covered more than one province. Muslim astronomers taught Chinese scholars the habits of keeping systematic observations night after night with precisely aligned instruments. The pathways that carried goods now carried methods. Movement also carried misfortunes. In the middle of the 14th century, a sickness rose from the valleys of the Great Plateau and along caravan tracks. At the port of Kaffa on the Black Sea, a town that sat under the eyes of the Golden Horde and became a node where Italians traded for steppe goods, the disease climbed onto ships and rode with sailors to Mediterranean harbors. What the world would later call the Black Death burned through port cities and then into inland towns. The very roads that had made the world feel connected now carried a plague that emptied streets. No ruler planned this. It was an unintended payment for a century of open travel. For the memory of Genghis himself, there remained a deeper current. The laws that men called the Yasa were never written out in a single codex, where a reader could turn a page and find a neat list of clauses. They lived in proclamations, in judgments, and in the habit of obedience to a ruler who promised fairness. Later, courts argued about the letter of the Yasa and built commentaries around what they believed the founder had willed. The Mongols themselves kept his words in their heads and in their stories. The secret history, written down in Chinese transcription of Mongol words a generation after his death, preserved the songs and quarrels of his youth and gave an inner voice to men who had otherwise been only the subjects of foreign chronicles. Persian historians like Juvaini and Rashid al-Din set Mongol deeds within long arcs that began with Adam and with the rulers of Iran. Chinese memorials traced how a steppe court could become a dynasty and still remain unlike any that had ruled before it. To read across these witnesses is to hear argument. It is also to hear agreement about certain traits. The founder rewarded loyalty, punished betrayal, welcomed useful skill, and insisted that envoys be safe. The center of the empire drifted as generations passed. Karakoram's timbers weathered. Kanbalik drew power to itself as Yuan officials managed river transport and granaries with a ritual rhythm that suited the south. Sarai prospered on the Volga with its market quarter and its mosques. Tabriz sent goods to the Mediterranean with taxes collected by men who wore fur in winter and linen in summer. Each branch wore the Mongol coat in its own style. Yet a traveler moving between them knew that certain sights would be the same wherever he went. He would see the black tug banner of horsetails at a commander's tent. He would see a relay post with fresh horses and a clerk. He would see a man wearing a Pisa pass, a toll gate without paying. He would hear the words that forbid any harm to a messenger and that promise swift punishment if harm is done. That is what remained of the first intention of the boy beside the Onon. He had built not only an army, but a way to move power across space. In the steppe homeland, centuries later, elders still rode out to Burkhan Khaldun to give thanks for a life that had begun there. They did not build a stone over the hidden grave that the clan had guarded by silence. They carried his memory in rituals and in names. In towns far from that mountain, rulers of later dynasties pointed to lines of descent from the house of the Blue Wolf and the Fallow Doe to justify their own claims. Some spoke his name with hate, some with admiration, and some with both at once. His descendants ruled China, Iran, and the steppes in different centuries and under different creeds. Yet wherever a courier rode under a safe conduct that men recognized, wherever a merchant demanded fair measure under a charter that carried a Mongol seal, and wherever a judge allowed a Brahmin and a monk and a mullah to argue in the same court without fear, a strand of his first ideas showed through.